I'm Dr. Louis Hoffman of Saybrook University, and this brief video lecture is on poetry and meaning, using poetry to facilitate meaning. This is part of a series of 6 lectures that is being developed as part of a class on poetry, healing, and growth. However, I'm making these available on open access for anyone who may be interested in the lectures. In this particular brief lecture, I'm going to cover existential psychology and meaning. I believe this provides a nice foundation for how we can understand meaning is relevant to poetry as well. Using poetry to facilitate meaning, myths as an intersection of individual and cultural meaning, and then poetry as sustaining myths and meaning. I begin with existential psychology because I think it provides a nice, broad, inclusive understanding of meaning that in many ways can help us understand poetry's role with meaning as well. Existential psychology and meaning is sometimes misunderstood. For example, it sometimes is purported that existential psychology will advocate that there is no meaning, that we are meaning-seeking creatures in a world that has no inherent meaning. This is a perspective of some people in existential psychology, but certainly is not the perspective of all, and from my perspective, I don't think it's even the take of the majority of the people involved in existential psychology. Rather, for the most part, existential psychology sees meaning as something vital and attainable in different ways, and so that it is something that really plays a central role. It's also sometimes misunderstood that existential psychology only focuses on meaning in the respect to coping. However, this again is really a misunderstanding of existential psychology that generally emerges from people that have not really engaged the literature. It doesn't take too much engaging the literature to see that existential psychology's view on meaning is much broader than seeing it just as something to cope with. It also helps people to thrive, to grow, to transform. And so while meaning can be used to cope, and this is one important function of meaning, certainly it is not the only one. And so here, one of the aspects that I want to talk about is the perspective, very common in existential psychology, that meaning helps to transform suffering. This was a very strongly emphasized point by Viktor Frankl, who would make the statement, suffering ceases to be suffering when we're able to find meaning. And this really shows that transformative aspect of it. Now, it's not saying that this ends suffering. It's not saying that it turns suffering into something good. Rather, it helps us to transform it. And I think this is important because some other misunderstandings about existential psychology include that sometimes it's viewed as glorifying or idealizing suffering as some good thing. This is not the case at all. Rather, it recognizes that suffering can play a positive role in people's lives. But existential psychology does not seek out suffering. It does not encourage people to seek out suffering. It does not glorify suffering. Rather, it takes suffering seriously and recognizes and believes that suffering is something that is a basic given. It's something that we are going to experience in our life. So it also does not try and say that suffering becomes something that is good. And this is really important when we think about trauma. So when someone experiences a traumatic incident, because we're able to transform that suffering over time, that doesn't mean that this tragedy that happened, or this abuse that happened, or this trauma that happened is something good. Rather, it is saying that through the process of gaining meaning, through the process of going through that suffering, we can find good things that emerge from it. Again, it is not coming back and saying, well, it's good that this trauma happened because this good came from it. No, instead, it's saying that through that suffering, there are good things that can come, even though that suffering was never something that was good or should be sought. Now, when we think of poetry and meaning, we can talk about at least 3 different things that I'm going to focus on today, although I think there are also some other aspects that could be discussed. Poetry can preserve meaning, identify meaning, and create meaning. Now, when we think about identifying and creating meaning, this also ties into a debate that happens in existential psychology at times. Some will say that we cannot create meaning. We can only discover meaning that is there, while others will say that it is possible to create meaning, or that we only create meaning. Personally, I think it is something that we can identify. There is meaning that we can identify that exists, as well as there's meaning that we can create. So it can be both of these. And in this, we'll talk about both aspects of those, although some might debate my take on this, or say that what I'm talking about is creating is really identifying, or vice versa. When we think of preserving meaning, I think of it in the sense of being a word photograph. Now, part of what happens with the preserving is that we have a descriptive element to it, that we describe an experience, or we describe something that we're trying to remember, or describe a person that we are trying to remember. But it's also more than that, because what poetry can do, as has been talked about in some of the other lectures and will be talked about in some of the future lectures, poetry can hold a bunch of things together. It can hold paradoxes together. It can hold the cognitive description and the emotional description. It brings these different aspects together, so in a sense it catches what is missed in a photo. So it's a different way of preserving meaning. Now, it can also work in conjunction with a photo as well. I'm reminded, I'll shift a little bit here. If you look right up here, hanging on my wall behind me, this is an example of this, that although you can't see it, in that picture there is a picture of myself with Robert Murney, who is one of my dearly loved mentors, and then a poem that I wrote for Dr. Murney when I was moving and would not be seeing him as much anymore. So what this poem has done is really helped to preserve that relationship in many ways. Now, Robert Murney has since passed away quite some time ago, but he still remains someone that is very influential to me. And I will, at times when I'm struggling with different aspects of my career, I will look at the picture and I'll read the poem and I'll think about that relationship, and it'll help sustain me in different ways and help me to approach things in a different way. So for me, that combination of the photo and the poem, they both illuminate different aspects of the meaning that I had in my relationship with Robert Murney. So it can preserve a lost relationship. And elegies are a type of poem that are about grief and loss, and they often help to capture a relationship in such a way. And when we think about this with grieving, I don't want to go too much in this. I also teach a class on poetry, loss, and grieving. But with elegies, they're able to hold together different aspects. In grieving, it's sometimes talked about that we need to grieve both the good and the bad to have a really full process of grieving. And sometimes when we grieve, we just idealize the individual, and we don't deal with some of the difficult aspects of the relationship with them. This may be particularly true with people who are important to us, such as parents, spouses, relatives, close friends, that we just grieve for those positive aspects. But there also can be an important aspect of working through the loss of other aspects of the relationship. Poems can hold all of that together, I think, in a beautiful way. And so these elegies are in many ways poems of remembrance. It's a genre of poetry that is quite a powerful type of poetry. We can also talk about trauma poems that might describe a traumatic experience or event. Now, these are particularly, I think, interesting when we talk about preserving meaning, is if we follow them over time, because what we might find is a particular trauma poem might evolve over time if we allow it to change in the writing, how we write it, or the author writes it. Also, different poems about a particular traumatic experience may provide a witness to change. That I remember talking with someone recently that talked about how they had wrote quite a few poems about an abusive relationship in the past over time, and at a certain point started to notice that there was a shift of having some empathy for the person that abused them, an understanding of what happened to them that led them to doing these terrible things. It wasn't excusing the behavior at all, but it provided some empathy and understanding around it that started to move towards forgiveness and a different understanding that was quite healing. So these different poems across time, they can remember and preserve our experiences, but also witness as they transform at the same time, which is preserving meaning in the moment, in a sense, for some of the original ones, but also preserving meaning over time in the evolution of the meaning of a particular event. So this is one powerful way that poetry can facilitate meaning, closely tied to memory in many ways. Okay, then identifying meaning. I think one of the beautiful things about this is when we connect it to paradox. Certainly it's not the only way. Many times I think we may write a poem and come back and reflect on it and see meanings that we didn't recognize, or through the process of writing the poem, identify meanings that are there that we just didn't recognize. But I think one of the things that can really be done is that it helps hold some of the aspects of the paradox together. I'm going to talk about an example of a poem in just a second that I think illustrates this in a way. So meaning can often be hidden in the paradox. It can be hidden in the paradox. We don't see it because we focus just on one aspect. And through the poem, we get to the other aspect, and as I've been talking about earlier, it can hold those together. So it can hold together suffering and strength, loss and love, changes and stability. Now, a couple of these will be then talked about in this poem that I'm going to get to next. And in this poem, it's a poem that I wrote recently. I don't think by any means it's a finished poem. I'm still working on revising it and clarifying it and making it hopefully a better poem through that process. But it is a poem that I wrote about my relationship with my wife, who I dearly love, and we've been together for quite some time now, and so been reflecting on how that love has changed over time, remaining just as deep, but is experienced differently. And this is something that happens often in relationships, and a lot of times because people want to hold on to a particular phase of a love relationship, they struggle and they worry about aspects of their relationship, thinking that they've fallen out of love because the love has transformed into something different, or go seeking out that early experience of love that can be very intoxicating instead of allowing for it to change. And so this poem in some ways is preserving meaning, as was talked about before, but in many ways is identifying meaning, including the paradoxes of meaning, the love and the changing, so the change and the stability of love in ways. Embers. In our youth, our love danced like flames of a raging fire, consuming everything with heat so intense passerbys could not help notice and be warmed by our love. Now, time has taken hold of our youth, like wood consumed in fire. It has gone, only the embers remain, still hot enough to kindle the fire anew, then returning again to subtly bright embers whose heat still dances without the energy of youthful fire. Our love, too, remains, continuing to burn, till the fuel that is us has been fully consumed, transformed to smoke and ashes, that like fire to forest gives way to life anew. I apologize about the one typo in that. But what this poem really did for me was it helped to hold together the different aspects of the love, that the strength there, the fire, the heat was still there and maybe even more intense. And it's talked about that the embers are actually the hottest part of the fire, though it's not recognized as such. And they also burn the longest, and they stay often until everything is consumed. All of the life providing what provides life for the fire has been consumed, so there's nothing left but the ashes. And I thought that was a beautiful metaphor in ways for love, and how it changes from something that is dramatic and big and bold and can be seen from long off in these big fires and flames dancing, to something that is more subtle. And if you watch embers closely, you'll notice that there's still the dancing, there's still the change of color, there's still the heat that comes off it in a different way, but it's more subtle. And yet retaining that original intensity of the heat. So for me, this was a way of preserving and identifying that meaning around the changes that often happens in a romantic love relationship. Okay, so using poetry to facilitate meaning. Here's we can talk about creating meaning in this slide. And it suggests that we are doing something active, that the poem is doing something for the individual. It suggests change. And so some examples of this is it can be used to change an attitude or perspective. It can be used to try and engage things differently. And let me give a couple examples here. One I'm not going to speak about much because a later lecture will talk about this more. But I think when we think about poems that are used for social change or activism, this can be one example, that it brings about a change in the individual through a motivation and creating meaning around the activity of engaging in. But let me mention a different one, and I'm not going to read the poem for this one, but I'll just speak about the poem. That there was a time when I was really struggling with a relationship with someone that I cared about deeply, that had changed in attitude towards me rather dramatically and become quite attacking and very mean-spirited. And I had trouble understanding what it was that happened and why this occurred. And so through time, what I did is I wrote a couple of poems in this person's voice, but there's one poem in particular that as I wrote it, it shifted something. I was able to get a deeper empathy and to change my understanding, and it was something that for me was able to preserve the relationship in a way, even though I had to put up some boundaries of self-protection where I didn't interact with this individual anymore. There was much about this individual and what I had gotten from our relationship that was very precious to me, and I didn't want to lose that, and I didn't want to lose my concern and even love for this individual that was very important to me. And so this poem brought about a meaning and a change through that meaning that was quite powerful, where I felt that I was able to restore the empathy and restore the love that I had for this individual through some deeper understanding of what might have been going on with this individual. It may not have been accurate of what was going on with this individual, but that in some ways is beside the point, because what it really was most essential is that it helped for me to be able to hold on to those things that were precious and to the very important aspects of meaning that I'd gotten beneficially from this relationship. Okay, myth is an intersection of individual and cultural meaning. I'm going to come back to some existential psychology here and talk about Rollo May in the book The Cry for Myth. This is one of my favorite books of all time. And in this book, May talks about myths and will say that myths are not false, but they're something that cannot be proven to be true. And he'll also talk about myths as meaning systems, and in ways they're cultural meaning systems. And so what May did in this book is he started off talking about the theory of myth, and then in the latter sections he goes through a number of stories, movies, books that really provide a type of cultural mythology and cultural meaning system. Now, he focused mostly on Western myths in this. And so building on that, I wrote a chapter in a book, Existential Psychology East-West, that really applied this to cross-cultural work. And then the whole third section of this book looked at different myths from different cultural perspectives. And so the way that this was conceived then is that myths often are wrestling with the different existential givens. The existential givens are basic issues in life that we all must face, such as death, the question of meaning, as we've been talking about, relationship, freedom, emotions or experience, and suffering. These are all things that are given in life. But how we respond to these often requires a personally and culturally specific response. And it's always informed by both the individual and the culture, in my view, on this. So that the myths are an interaction of the person and the culture. Combine both elements to this in creating a meaning system. Now, not all poems that are written, not all stories that are written are going to be cultural myths that resonate with a lot of people, but they do create these systems of meaning, ways of understanding, in a sense, that again are not proven to be true. Poems, similarly, they are forms of meaning that generally cannot be proven. They're normally more about experience and perspective and meaning that we bring to things. Poems are not seeking scientific truth, though they are seeking a type of understanding, and I think they can be a way of knowing in a very real sense. There's an epistemological aspect of poetry, I think, in that sense. Poems are always influenced by culture, as I mentioned before, even if this is not recognized. And they'll often draw in others who share the meaning of a poem. And we see this. We see this when we share poems that other people resonate with. We often find a shared meaning in there. If it's a poem that we write and others are drawn to it, it creates kind of a shared meaning. And even almost a mini culture at times can be created around this shared meaning system, this shared experience that people have. So I think this is some of the way that the poems really can create these myths, these understandings, these meaning systems that draw people in and help people sustain. So it's not always our own poems that are this, but it can also be the poems of others. So then, just as we move towards closing here, let me talk briefly about sustaining meaning. The idea of sustaining meaning is a type of meaning that really is transformative, that helps us cope, survive, and thrive. It transforms one life. And there are meanings that could be considered small meanings or pseudo meanings or different things that are things that people ascribe meaning to and certainly inform people's lives that aren't necessarily sustaining. I think a common one of these can be the idea of money or power that we see in our culture, that a lot of people find material wealth, it's a guiding source of meaning, but it's not a sustaining source of meaning in a psychological or emotional sense. So sustaining meaning is able to help cope with difficult situations, survive through it, and even thrive through them oftentimes. So sustaining meaning can be connected to poetry as well, our own poems and the poems of others that can serve to a sustaining role, that can help connect with this meaning that is a powerful meaning that helps us to cope, survive, and even thrive. Okay, so hopefully this video lecture on meaning in poetry has been helpful. Again, this just touches on some aspects of meaning in poetry, and certainly there is a lot of other perspectives and aspects that could be considered, but hopefully this is a helpful start.